Hi everyone and welcome to this week's lesson on anxiety, which links into the topic of arousal that we looked at last week. So today we're going to define what anxiety is, look at its impact on our performance, the different types of anxiety, and there's four that you need to be able to recall, and the different ways that we can actually measure anxiety. So first off, definition. So this is our definition: a negative emotional feeling, belief or thoughts which result from arousal or stress. So this usually occurs when we're over aroused and that leads into anxiety, feeling anxious about a particular situation or our performance. So let's have a look at the types of anxiety. So as I said before, there's four. The first one is called state anxiety. So this is what we call situation-specific anxiety. So it's not where the performer would be suffering anxiety throughout the performance, it might be one particular period within that. So an example could be a football player who's played well throughout the game, it comes to a penalty shootout, and then they have a poor execution of the technique resulting in a poor and missed penalty. Or it could be a golfer who's played well throughout the 4 rounds of a competition. In the last couple of holes, they're in with a chance of winning the tournament, but then they start to make maybe bad decisions or the technique becomes poor. So it is temporary. So we know this as a state. And it can change from moment to moment. So we might start off a game playing quite well, but there could be an instance within that game, something occurs. It could be a bad decision we've made. It could be a defender who fails to mark someone who's a threat and that player then scores. But we can come back from that. So it can fluctuate during performance depending on how well we're actually performing and what maybe the score is in that particular contest. So we can also look at what we call competitive state anxiety. So this is our anxiety during competitive situations. So again, we might find in training that a player doesn't display any signs of state anxiety, but then when we put them into a competitive situation, that anxiety then can creep up, and it could be important events as well. Trait anxiety is where we'll be anxious in most situations. Okay, so we perceive all of these situations as threatening. So this could be someone who, when they come to play sport or playing competitions, then they tend to display signs and symptoms of anxiety. And we'll look at those in a moment. So it's not just a one-off occurrence. This is most of the time the person's likely to feel a state of anxiety. So we say it's probably genetic, stable and enduring. So genetic, it's how we've been born to be like this. So it's not going to change much. It's not going to be that the player performs poorly one week, but then next week they'll be good. Okay? This is likely to be ongoing. So as we said before, they're more likely to be anxious in a wider range of situations. So it might not just be in competitions, it could be within training as well. So we know this as a trait. Okay. And like we had competitive state anxiety, we've got competitive trait anxiety. So with competitive trait, they would generally perceive all those competitive situations as threatening, not just a one-off. So to have the distinction between competitive state, this could be where, if we use golf for example, when it comes to a major tournament like the Masters or the Open, the player might then show high levels of state anxiety because of the importance of the competition. But when they're playing other competitions, they don't show it. Whereas someone who has competitive trait anxiety would show that anxiety whatever the level of competition is. The third type is called cognitive or psychological anxiety. And again, don't use the word mentally, always refer to it as cognitive or psychological. So if you look at the symptoms, they're very, very similar to those that we looked at for arousal. So that nervousness, that apprehension, that worry. So all things which is going through our mind. And the impact of that could be the perceptual narrowing, where we're not able to focus on relevant cues. So we're doubting ourselves, we're doubting our own ability to complete that task successfully. And then we have somatic And again, similar to what we looked at with arousal, the physiological symptoms are very similar. So it's that increased heart rate and respiration, tense muscles. So you don't have to learn these separately from the effects of arousal. They are more or less the same. Right, so let's start to look at the impact that it could have on our performance and what happens leading up to performance. So if we look at the graph here, okay, so we can see we've got level of competitive anxiety on our vertical axes, and along the horizontal, the days leading up to competition. So if we notice, if we look at somatic anxiety first, it's very low in the week and the hours leading up to the event. But the closer we get to that particular event, as we can see, then it will start to increase. Okay, at this point here, this is where it's increasing. And once we start our competition, then we can see a dramatic decline, because we're focused on the game, so that heart rate will tend to settle, and we'll be using our increased heart rate respiration for actually performing in the contest. Whereas if we look at cognitive anxiety, even a week before competition, that can be high, because we could be going over it in our mind, particularly if we've had previous poor performance, or we're playing against opposition we haven't got a good record at. We can actually place ourselves in that situation, and that worry can be high. And the key point now is once we start competition, it could decrease, and if it decreases, it's probably because we've started well. Our first few passes have found their target. But again, it could then increase again, because that could be where something's gone wrong, okay, where we made bad errors, silly mistakes, or rash challenges. So as we said before with cognitive anxiety, key word here is that it can fluctuate throughout the competition. So let's just reiterate those points. So cognitive, high in the day and weeks before the event, gets higher as we get close to the competition commencing. It initially decreases, but as we said before, it can fluctuate during that event depending upon success or failure. Whereas somatic, lower in the days before the event, and then increases in the hours before the event, and then decreases once we commence. Again, this graph, we can look at it in terms of arousal. If we look firstly at our somatic state anxiety, we have, if you can see, more like an inverted U shape going on here. Yeah. So very, very similar to the inverted U theory. So what we mean by this is we can have some low levels of somatic anxiety. So all the way up to here, it's not going to negatively affect our performance. If it's too low, we're probably not prepared for the competition, like we said with arousal. But we can get up to an optimum state where that somatic anxiety has a benefit on our performance. So as we said before, if we're doing a physical activity, increasing the heart rate, breathing, etc., are all going to be positive effects to prepare the body for competition. But any further increase in that somatic anxiety, again, can have a negative effect on a performance. So our level of somatic anxiety has more of an inverted U shape. And then if we compare that to cognitive anxiety, as we can see now, it's similar to dry theory, but with it, rather than it be a positive linear relationship, it's more of a negative linear relationship. Okay, so the higher the level of state anxiety, as you can see here, the lower our level of performance will be. Okay, so we can only tolerate small increases in cognitive anxiety, otherwise it will have a negative effect on our performance. Okay. So just reiterating the points that we've said there. Okay, so what we need to look at now is how can we measure anxiety? Well, there's three major ways that we can do that. Okay. So the first one we're going to look at is observation. We've also got self-report questionnaires and physiological measures. So we'll actually start with the self-report questionnaire. So these are what are given to an athlete to complete before the competition. Ideally, very, very close to actually competing. So there will be a series of questions which ask us about our emotions, and we have to rate ourselves depending upon what scale is used. Some can go from low to high, from strongly agree to strongly disagree, depending on which questionnaire we complete. One of your tasks this week will be to complete a SCAT questionnaire. So, the advantages for doing a self-report questionnaire. Well, firstly, it's cheap, because all you need is maybe an electronic version or a paper version. It's quick and easy to administer. So if you've got, let's say, 100 people in a sports hall, that could be given and only would need one administrator to actually do that. So it's quick to do and we can get large numbers completed at the same time. The drawbacks though is sometimes if the person's completing the questionnaire by themselves, they may misinterpret the questions. Okay, so you've got to be very, very clear in terms of the language that you're using when you design these. If there's any ambiguous questions, that could be then problematic for the person completing it. Our key point here is about socially desirable answers. What we mean by that is if we're thinking, what does the observer want to know about me? So if the questionnaire is about anxiety, we probably don't want to be saying that we're anxious when we take part in a competition, because we may think that might influence the coach maybe to select us or not. So we might give answers that we think the person might want. It might not be a true reflection of ourselves. Time to complete the test can influence as well. So if we're rushing to do it, okay, it could be a factor. But probably more important is if we're given, let's say, a week before we compete, well, we're not actually in that moment. And as we saw previously, that somatic anxiety won't have kicked in yet. So we probably won't get a true and accurate reflection of our anxiety levels. So there's different types that we can look at. So the first we're going to look at is the state trait anxiety inventory. So this measures our level of anxiety in a particular situation. Okay, and it's based on 20 questions which relate to trait anxiety. So it's about how nervous we'll go into feel before a situation. Okay. So if we come out with high trait anxiety, then we're more likely to suffer from high state anxiety. The SCAT test is one you're going to complete yourselves this week. So this is called the Sport Competition Anxiety Test. So this measures our trait anxiety pre-competition. So we usually have around about 15 statements to complete. So it asks us a series of questions and tries to find out if we're likely to experience high anxiety before competing. So when you complete this SCAT test yourself, make sure you are honest with your answers. Otherwise, the results won't mean anything to you. Okay, and the results are confidential to yourself. We've also got the CSAI test. Okay, so the Competitive State Anxiety Inventory. Okay, so this measures both cognitive state, somatic state, and self-confidence in a competitive situation. So it's important to give this to the athlete as close as possible to the event. Okay, so up to 1 hour in this case. That way we'll get more realistic responses, and particularly as regards the somatic anxiety. So what are the benefits of using these? Well, the coach can use them to try and assess how anxiety performers might become. And how could we use them? Well, a coach may use them in terms of selection. Who's going to be able to cope in those real pressure situations? So if we look at penalty shootouts, for example, who will be able to cope under that pressure? But also we can use it to try and help the performer to deal with those anxieties, those situations. So we'll come up with some kind of stress management technique, and we'll look at stress management in a couple of weeks' time. The second method we could use is observation, and this is probably provides us with the most valuable and realistic information. So what we would do here is assess the performer in the actual situation, so when they're actually competing. And what we'd be looking for is symptoms of changes in behaviour. Okay? So what happens to them when they actually start to compete? So the two types of data we will find. Firstly, that individual behaviour. So we're looking for nervous actions, fidgeting for example, or it could be becoming quiet when they're usually loud, or vice versa, becoming argumentative. And then aspects of performance, so looking at the skill execution. So a sign here that the person was suffering from anxiety could be that they're making poor decisions, okay, they might be slow to react, and the actual execution, or maybe simple skills that they can perform quite well usually, seem to become more inconsistent and lots of mistakes. So even though it's probably a really valid method of measuring anxiety, there are drawbacks. And the first one would be that we need several observations to get a true picture of that particular athlete. We couldn't watch them just on one performance because there could be lots of variables which affect that. It could be the level of competition, how they've been training, how they're feeling fatigued. So we'd have to do that over several times. So that would be expensive and time consuming to do so. Secondly, we have to know that performer well, because we have to look at, well, what are the changes in the behaviour? If we don't know that person beforehand, we wouldn't know if that competition has actually changed their behaviour. And actually knowing that we're being observed can cause anxiety. Okay? So something we'll look at later in the course is evaluation apprehension. So it's when we know we're being observed, then we might perform differently. For some people, it could cause them to improve maybe their performance, or for others, it might cause more anxiety. So we can't tell then whether it's the actual competition which is causing anxiety, or knowing that we're being observed. And the third method is physiological measures. So with this gives us accurate data. Okay, so it is objective. So we could look at things like heart rate, muscle responses, respiration rate, sweat production. Okay, so as we said before, it's accurate data depending on how we actually record it. So for example, we could use heart rate monitors to look at changes in performance in terms of whether they were suffering from anxiety. The difficulty with that could be that the heart rate changes might be due to the competition itself. So it can provide accurate data depending on how we measure it. But again, a drawback here could be if we know we've got this monitor on, that might cause us to actually increase our anxiety levels and therefore our heart rate. And it is difficult to record that information in a game situation. For instance, a lot of players would not like wearing a heart rate monitor in competition. They might be more willing to do so in training, but anything which might cause them difficulty is likely not going to get their permission to use it. Okay? And as we said with observation, changes in our heart rate, anxiety levels could occur because we actually know we're being evaluated. And if we try to get accurate data in a lab situation, it's not the same situation. They're probably not the same pressure. So if we try to recreate a penalty shootout in a lab, it's not going to be the same as it actually being in that situation, or maybe a World Cup semi-final, or the last ball in cricket in a 2020 final.